Hello everyone, today we talk about a very actual topic that I think I addressed here and there but never pictured for what it was. You know that I believe fundamentally what is happening in the world right now is incredibly similar to what was happening in the world by, say, the first half of the 14th century. And I don't need to digress on this now because just historical parallelism that I draw when I speak about specific, specifically pertinent historical evidence to this. But a feature, right, of that time was the increase in ideologism and, in a sense, also in a fragmentation, an idea of the end of universalism, and a process of modernization and secularization that, at the time, had of course, was already quite advanced compared to, say, the ancient world and the ancestral archetypal origins, let's say, of that case, Western culture tradition that, again, were pretty universal elsewhere. Today, we are in a much more advanced stage where things have gone basically completely wrong at so many levels that are not, in fact, the ones that you normally think they are. They're something really beyond, and they're not intuitive, right? So it's not just saying, this person did, or this country did this or did that, or it's much. Those are just the consequences of something else that is not even can't be reconnected to the normal categorical set of ideologies that we normally just attribute the responsibility to. It's a deception. It's basically saying, everything depends on this, and it's narrowing down the explanation to a monofactorial and kind of extremely simplified, symbolic and emotional version of the story. That's not, we all reason essentially through symbols and motion, but many don't really read through them adequately. Just to make an example, when we talk, and we will probably talk in the future about nationalism and socialism in a more, properly historical and ideological way, right? Especially in comparison to tradition and universalism, that are the only parameters fundamentally that you can use, are the only ones that we know, right? And we will observe how, aside from their common collectivistic nature, these are not, first of all, they're just in fact the manifestation of a dynamic that, in a sense, always existed, and that is not, in this sense, to be paralleled to our times, especially from in terms of absolute dimension. But let's say it's manifestation of the broader logic that is the only one through which the world can be interpreted fundamentally. And as you know, especially if you're a regular follower, I've began to make this point powerfully in ways that, again, are very mostly archetypical, but that spread fundamentally as a, if anything, as a tool of interpretation to anything that you can find. And I've been amazed. I made that video, for example, criticizing the otherwise appreciated Jordan Peterson regarding the fact that all these ideologues are saying, we have to find meaning and discover what it is and everything. It's just at hand. Like it was written on on an enormous amount of books of anthropology, of history, of religion. It's known. It's a very specific doctrine that was studied pretty much everywhere in the West up to 80 years ago and beyond, and still, if you go to a library, you can read this, and this is the aspect that frightens me the most, in a sense. It's the active disruption, right? This is not just amnesia in the sense that, of course, people are ever more ignorant towards things that really matter, right? Sometimes I'm surprised when people say, well, people today are more educated than in the past, in the sense that they are brought to learn quantitatively more concepts. Yes, but what about the form of them? What about the relevance of them? What about the capacity of it? Simply, if you have a lot of things, doesn't mean that that lot of things is ordered in a way that can be functional, right? So it doesn't mean anything practically, and the form has been destroyed, right? The substance is there. Again, these texts are everywhere, and also just much more sound. I mean, let's leave aside this kind of almost exoteric understanding of universalism and tradition, but simply saying reading Kant or Locke or Hume, right? Who does that, right? And who especially does that by, in an immediate way. That is to say, without depending on somebody else's interpretation of that. And I'm not saying not knowing that true, because that of course is needed. You need historiography, you need criticism, whatever. But it's often the pattern of interpretation that has taken an ever more deterministic, materialistic, relativistic understanding. Hell, even tradition, say in the 70s, has been resumed by feminism, by environmentalism and so on, and twisted the narrative they wanted to adopt. This is just what is that charlatan that wrote Fingerprints of the God? That's just the same thing, just recycled in a kind of hippie fashion, and without, stripped of course of all the most controversial aspects of that would make it lean toward conservatism, and used to say, fuck authority and whatever. I mean, we're arrived to the point when you can't literally have those books selling millions of copies and people reading them and not having idea of the cultural reference anymore. This is a huge issue. I noticed yesterday, by the way, I made that video on my PhD tales that maybe you don't like, because I don't know, it's me talking about myself and how it's gone. Believe me, that's really useful. It explains you how to make this kind of research and gaining that kind of perspective and that kind of awareness. So I realized that some videos are maybe more or less boring than others, but why that one specifically? This one will surely get lots more views, but basically I'm saying almost the same things, just in a different context. And so that's the point. Again, this is an example, right? You come here listening for history stuff, but you don't get that this is part of a world that is systemically thought. And so you just get the tiny part that you can individually swallow for a time, and then you completely don't care about the rest. That's an issue, right? Okay, there are people who understand that, and they are my most regular and affectionate followers, and I thank for that. But let's say in general, it seems to me that this is exactly the problem everywhere, right? We've come to a point where it's not even a bulimia of knowledge, right? Because if there had been such a thing, people would actually want to know more. What is happening today is that people don't need to know more. They don't want to know more. They don't want to. They actually want explicitly, expressively, and actively to know less. Minimalism, kind of a retreat from the world, like the idea that you are concluded within yourself, and that you don't need, that there's no other great thing that could give meaning to your existence and lighting you up and making you shine and even transfiguring in the most beautiful ways that you can imagine. No, people want to be self-aware, what the hell that means, and thinking that going to the gym will not make them die of cancer at 40, or that eating some non-junky food is that their highest moral achievement, or I don't know what. And also buying, in fact, in this kind of cheap ideologies that are apparently powerful, not because again they're sound or intelligent or whatever, but they are in a sense echoed by, in part it's the social media environment. It's true, but it's not even that. It's the fact that objectively they're owned by lots of people. But when you actually press on it, it's all a soft spot, because they are built on nothing, and they simply vanish as soon as you counter them. And that's the interesting part of it, that, as I often said also to my conservative audience, like if you think that as conservatives we are special at this point in history, frankly we aren't, right? Just being slightly more intelligent than a total idiot is not really it's not really an achievement, right? You're just essentially setting you're evaluating yourself on the base of an idiot. That is basically the again, you have both essentially the same idiot's perspective, just you think to be slightly more because some, in the back of your mind, you're reminded that maybe being a better person is something useful, something like that, and completely missing the entire meaning of tradition and values and what they actually mean and how they're paraded to you. Now, so in the last years, naturally, there's been a lot of talk about these problems of ideologization, right? They started with what was the things of the Russian interference in the American elections, the idea that there was a radicalization of ideology, which objectively began, if you look at American politics, especially since Obama and Trump, then embodying this turn in different ways, naturally, but still riding the wave of this radical and sudden, apparently, transformation. And that's why also it's striking, because it does really seem like my beloved early 14th century, that you would have not expected to happen so fast if you just, however, had just looked beyond the surface. That's why I always say there is no such a thing like we shouldn't flatter ourselves too much, nor there are historical dynamics. That's also what we've been told by the Marxistic, deterministic, relativistic, and materialistic idea that that historical changes or processes are very complex and they take a long time, and there are different perspectives and debate. That actually means that you don't know shit about what that historical phenomenon actually means, because you've had any idea of how normally historical phenomena do manifest, while of course there are larger and smaller dynamics. Still, some changes are dramatically sudden, right? They're not just a matter of interpretation. I mean, just think about how the Soviet Union collapsed, or other issues that nobody had foreseen, by the way. Like lots of other things, by the way, that are triggered maybe even just by something different, like, I don't know, think COVID, how much it changed. I remember made a video about COVID a couple of years ago, and it's not that I've ever been particularly concerned of the illness per se, but I was perfectly aware of the fact that it would have changed everything in terms of political and social, and as we've seen, even military thinking. Back in autumn, I thought about this. I knew that Russia was up to something. It was obvious that would have been the best moment to act in that regard from their perspective, and still, however, with the results we have seen, because again, it wasn't that sound. I mean, trying is good as long as you also make kind of background check of how at least the minimal basic things could go right, and that didn't happen. In any case, that's a completely different topic. I'm not going to discuss probably the war in Ukraine, and I'm not doing it. If you wonder why I don't, even as a military historical channel that is coming back to be so, it's exactly because I like to look at problems also from a positively theoretical point of view. That is to say, not abstract. That's the other thing of the day, right? Thinking that theory means something without evidence or proof, or that theory means it's something systematically and rationally laid out on the base of evidence you can build up as a pattern of interpretation of reality, which is a completely different thing. But again, even the way we are changing language is terrifying, in my opinion. The semantics and the most brutal proof that we're given in some ways is accepting even the rules of this made-up language that, by the way, is quite grammatically incorrect, but properly, say, departing from simply the etymological meaning of the words. I don't know about you, but throughout all my life, like, whenever I think of a word and say, where the hell it comes from, and you realize the etymology is foreign, it can't come from another language, that maybe it's a dead language as well. I want to check that out. I want to understand what that properly means. And there are certain terms that I realized have been simply enforced ideologically. Like, for example, even the same concepts of, we can't even talk about simple terms, but I mean, some shades are debatable, of course, but even the way we have been enforced the idea of society, for example, as a broader descriptor what would be better to call as community, frankly, because it would involve all the pack, right? Both, politically, socially, and military. No, socially, because of course Marxism has decided that ideal history does not exist, political decision does not exist. Everything is mechanic, and it happens because of some, in fact, structural, material thing that is abstract from personal obligation. Of course, war does not exist because starting war is the first way to destroy any possible form of collectivism, from nationalism to socialism, etc. That doesn't exist. Even the same idea of conservatives calling themselves capitalists. Do you know that capitalist is a term invented by a communist? Basically, you're labeling yourself with what a communist called you, by the way, to insult you because he wanted to steal your property and kill you, and also, by the way, flipping completely what the best of the philosophies of idealism that Marxism completely flipped, because it hated that sense of meaning and purpose. Actually stems from that concept. I mean, capitalists shouldn't. There is no capitalism. That's simply how humans interact naturally in an environment when they want to survive, and they cooperate with each other for doing that. And that's what humans do by default. There is no such thing like capitalism or socialism or communism. It's just a trick, right? Remember always, these ideologies are founded on the denial of humanity, which means in practice also as theories that they deny the very evidence that history and any other field, politology, sociology, polemology, actually show, because they want to prevent you with that. They tell you, there is this pattern interpretation, buy it, and don't study anything else but indoctrinate yourself on this stuff, so you keep remaining ignorant and we don't have to fear from you. And that's it, and they go with that. And the unfortunate thing is that this began to happen for reasons that we can't maybe even today digress historically, but it does have to do with a sort of that kind of weakening of ourselves at the end of the day. It's like the twilight of the gods. And so what is happening within us individually, not because somebody else made it. If you think like that, it's because you essentially accept a superstition, that is to say, literally also, blessed etymology, something that stays, that looms over you, basically keeps you under, and that you decide. Also, the principle, the definition of enlightenment by Kant, because all enlightenment, and the enlightenment had a positive side, a very good positive side next to the demonic one that, again, every phase in human civilization had by a certain degree. Said that is a superstition, is imposed by, it's a condition of slavery practically imposed by yourself. You are the only responsible for what happens to you, right? It doesn't matter that you will succeed if you learn to be responsible. That's not the point. That's not the point. And that's in fact what also many conservatives think, that they will succeed just because they call themselves like that, or they want to see like something like, no. You have to spit blood to succeed. Otherwise you will fail. And still it will be your fault, right? Because there is nobody else that can make it happen. You can be grateful for the fact that there is, again, a community, a humanity that does help each other, but enforcing the system in a dirigistic way that basically just takes from others without even explaining what is going on, and threatens you violently if you're not even provided with an adequate possibility of negotiation and whatever, which unfortunately doesn't happen, but ideologically this extremistic movements really would like to enforce, and they succeeded in some times historically, all failing, by the way, because either they liberalized in some way or they crumbled, and most of the time they simply crumbled without any hope. And it's an incredible risk, by the way, for themselves as well, because these things do not really work. They never worked, right? They worked especially in the most underdeveloped countries, the ones that lacked more of tradition, right? That's the other thing that is often confused. Being backwards and primitive and underdeveloped doesn't mean to be more traditional or more valuable or more capable. Quite often it means the exact contrary, because these are exactly the places where There was not enough strength to create something that could work, and that could work on the base of that individual liberty that makes the bulk of a sound community. In fact, this is the point that I was reflecting on mostly these days, is on the value of democracy. That also some ideologues of the, let's say, of this kind of nostalgic side of tradition and universalism sometimes got wrong, because they leaned also unawarely, in a sense, towards some collectivistic ideologies themselves. I mean, Nazi fascism, for example. They somewhat, in fact, misinterpreted in the same way, that by shifting the semantics a little bit. It's objectively true that the term democracy in itself is distasteful, right? Because the demos is exactly the most inferior part of the actual people, right? It's something that it's basically the last. They are the lowest. I don't know. Even here, I will try not to use a classistic vocabulary, because otherwise it would be just proof that Marxism infected irreversibly our dictionary or our vocabulary. But the idea is that these were the lesser people. They were the people who had less individual capacity in all civilizations, always. This is not a saying, no, the Chinese didn't have this, or the European. No, this happens still today everywhere. It's universal, it's human, right? Just a way to start saying that, yes, cultures can be inferior or superior to others without being racist, because humanity is universal, as a matter of fact. And that's yet another thing that today doesn't quite get much support. Let's put it in this way. But the point being this, that by democracy we don't really mean the idea that the less have to rule, right? This is not a dictatorship of the proletariat. This fundamentally never existed anywhere, right? Not even in those systems where it was kind of a radical democracy where everybody could vote and influence every single step of the way. There was ever like such a thing like direct democracy. And in any case, these were all systems that crumbled dramatically. The democracy we're talking about is more like a form of egalitarian community, where the essentially the middle class, and hopefully therefore the majority of the people, has an individual power, right? And this power is not, of course, to be intended like in the revolutionary sense, the power of the people, because the people, by definition, I mean in the lesser sense of the proletarian sense, doesn't actually have any, by definition, right? The proletarians can move just en masse, because what they lack is equality, and they've been essentially broke down every time. Even if you temporarily, like I don't know, think about the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, they temporarily had this, they were always instrumentalized, because none of them had the intellectual capacities or tools to operate politically or military or anything, but they were guided, they were exploited, right? They were always eventually brought down, and very often purged and taken out of the way for the establishment to basically work on their, to smash them and to exploit their remains for the few that the system could continue going on that ideological base. It means the individual as somebody capable of understanding the necessity of civilization. And this is the point exactly that disturbs me a bit, because democracy, as it's being criticized by so many illiterate conservatives and liberals, for that matter, because of course the liberals lean towards the kind of the proletarian obsession. The conservatives look at democracy and say, democracy is bad just by definition. They don't know, of course, the demos, the whole thing, but they say, no, democracy is bad because they think, today, this is the equation of the small brain. Democracy equates gender theory, right? We have arrived at this complete degeneration of any form of logic or political culture, not because of gender theory, that it is an abomination of the dignity of mankind, but because people associate that to democracy. There are things that have nothing to do with each other. One is a form of government. The other thing is is lunacy exploited in a politically radical sense. It has nothing to do with the form of government. The idea of the form of government where everybody is, I don't know about you, but where would you like to live? In a place like it's just like a feudal reality that of course we should learn to be able to rehabilitate in a sense, because again, if those that are at the top, it's because they do maintain some greater capacity than the people that are at the bottom. But again, this is by evaluating the people at the bottom as a point of reference. It doesn't speak in absolute terms. Or would you prefer to live, so even being the elite of a feudal reality and living in a world of misery of the other people that you have to keep down, or would you like to live in a world where everybody is kind of an intelligent, good, affluent person? And we absolutely have all the wealth in the world to make it happen tomorrow. I don't know, I would like the latter. Right? If you look at all the most successful civilization in history, it's not that they started from democracy. They started from this sound bulk of middle class that managed to take over the others, not because they were particularly even more advanced, but because they were politically united, and they had the individual resources to understand the importance of that cultural cohesion. We're talking about the Romano-Italic peasantry that took over the world. We're talking about even the Germanic tribesmen that were successful. The more their middle like their middle freemen, not middle class per se, but was functional. We're talking about, I don't know, the Swiss peasants that were kind of something between burghers and peasants, but they stuck together, managed to win their own space, and succeeding. Think about the Dutch. Think about all the great successful peoples in history and what they got and what was their common denominator, right? The Mongol Empire didn't last anything, right? It's not a model to which you can civilize the world and saying, understanding the connection between politics and military action and social consequences. If you don't have people that actually participate fully to that idea, if your idea is that you're somebody else's possession, right? So that's also why the West kind of topped human civilization historically, because we were fundamentally based on this idea that we had some intrinsic liberties that could not be infringed, and it was up to us individually to fight or die to defend them. Right, and it happened for reasons that, of course, elude also the space of today's video. But it's objectively not, again, as a Marxist would like to. It's a socio-economical issue. It's not a socio-economical issue. It's a political, social, and military, and in this sense, wholly cultural issue of effectiveness. Right, of unitary effectiveness. Even just the attitude that we see today in basically pretending that a system just has to split and break down, and that you prefer even to sabotage your own country, to pretend there are other countries that are, by the way, far worse than yours by any cultural indicator, that you also need to make up to pretend that they actually have anything to do with that, a positivity, or let alone a superiority, reveals that you have an extremely poor cultural, moral, political, and probably traditional understanding. You are the same level of collectivistic iconoclasm that you find in socialism, and even in communism. Nationalism is fundamentally the same thing. The anxiety, for example, of escaping any form of, of universal cooperation with institutions that actually are, multilaterally coming together, bringing their own force to expand those higher standards further, and succeeding in doing that, is as a phobia, literally, towards these institutions. It's a grave form of radical cultural inferiority. It's a form of great self-hatred, of fear, of paranoia, of something that you do not accept because you realize that you cannot afford it. right? And this is what we're witnessing, especially in the conservative world right now, because again, while it's true that we should judge groups at this point by the elite, and so trying to reason a little bit in this moment of crisis in as if feudalism was already in, because it's always been in a way or another, because again, there's never been such a thing like the democracy that we have been Marxistically enforced. There's always been an elite. There have always been people that were better all along and that made things work, and the others just basically profited and parasitically sucked from it, just against the threat of destruction, right? Of self-destruction, by the way. And that's a kind of thing that you understand cannot subsist on a nationalistic base either, because if you have any historical understanding, you know that peoples that try to pretend that they by entrenching themselves somewhere and without making any further effort of cooperation, etc., there couldn't be any bright future for them. Isolationism is yet another form, a grave form of cultural inferiority and paranoia, and it's really an incredible selfish and therefore anti-traditional declaration, not being wanting to make any effort for the future of your own people, of your own country, of your own nation. Right, your own nation can do great things when it cooperates and when it is an example, not when it passively aggressively shuts down because the majority of its people are basically uneducated to the point that can't even understand the obvious necessity of stepping in the world in some disputes and solving the matter also in favor of its own country. Right, it's a self-destructive and completely I don't know, alienated. It's something terrifying. I don't know how psychologically one can live like this. I mean, I could even understand it if it wasn't for what you have. I mean, there are some countries that are basically born to be paranoid because they've been, raped and enslaved and massacred for centuries, and therefore, they're fucked up just in the head in many ways, and they're small and they never had any power, but so they say, okay, I want to see just nothing bad to happen to me. That I can understand, that you lack a civilizational tool, but when you are something like the most powerful country in the world, it's just like, castrating yourself, because you fear that you may accidentally ingravidate, the woman that you love, right? It doesn't make any actual sense. It's like counterintuitive, irrational, dangerous. And it's fueled by hatred. It's fueled by self-hatred. It's fueled by the fact that you cannot even withstand the criticism of people that fundamentally do not even have an actual power on you more than you have on them. Right? Have you ever read the White Man's Burden? Right? If you even are a traditionalist, how can't you even understand such things, right? And today I'm not going to talk about colonialism or whatever, because that's still one of the chapters that I don't understand why people feel so paranoid and self-hating for. I give you that I come from a country that maybe didn't have this dramatic colonialism compared to the major powers like the British, the French, the Spanish, etc. But let's say, in a way, it was like a broader Western thing, and they're blaming it on whites altogether. So I just say screw you at that point, and I will simply step in, because that's one of the things that, again, it's so evident from a cultural point of view that the only reason why this self-hatred exists is that you're too weak to accept the criticism of people that are maybe stronger than you, but are just dramatically weak in cultural terms. I mean, do you see anywhere in culture today somebody that, for example, hates colonialism, that is not a paranoid, undereducated, deeply, culturally complex individual that propagates a radical leftist agenda? Because frankly, I don't find any of them. I mean, yes, I can find somebody that mildly says, well, yeah, maybe colonialism in some instances was not a good idea, but they don't even start from saying, what was the context of that time and why colonialism even actually happened, and why was there this Western centrality, and also what were the actual consequences. Because you see, if anything, let's leave aside the most obvious reality that, if you kill a certain amount of people that on a regular identitary and cultural and existential base do not do anything but killing each other in the same way, it's obvious that if you kill, say, innocent civilians, you're doing something bad. But at the same time, what was the world like doing, or even the same victims doing at the same time? Right, you may at least want to consider that, right? And there is an enormous load of that kind of collectivistic, nationalistic, and therefore that's simply the first step to socialistic, parasitistic, etc. ideology that says, we are, I don't know, we have arrived. It's not even about countries. You see, I can't even understand that, say, a country says sorry to another for the bad things that were done during colonialism. What I don't understand is how this passed to a racial dimension, which is, by the way, open racism in the first place. And secondly, like, for things that, I don't know, happened 300 years ago, what the hell, do I have to do with that? Or even if they happened, 80 years ago, as they did, I wasn't there, right? And nor my ancestors that I know committed war crimes. And so what the hell do I have to do with this whole thing? The cards have been so mixed to the point that if you pretend that anybody who has a point regarding these issues that is evidently aimed at basically damaging you for essentially hoping to that this level's difference that evidently exists between you and that person, if you're intimidated by this, you're just not a strong person, right? A conservative should not say, I'm sorry for that. Shouldn't give a fuck about that. Like any normal, dignified human being should do. And so this is, in my opinion, probably one of the greatest indicators of how there can't be really and realistically, let's say better, an option nowadays to pretend that masses all of a sudden would realize that this is just lunacy altogether from both sides, right? This is valid also for racism. This is valid for any form of, again, paranoid shutting down and let's say fueling of narrow, scientifically unevidenced and historically unfounded radical ideologies that just speak a history of deep inferiority complex and nothing else, right? A racist has inferiority complex. An anti-colonialist has inferiority complex. There is no way around this, right? And the main reason, of course, why this seems to be happening is, of course, that history is being taken out of the way. Because if history was really studied or known, here it's not even about a matter of personal opinion or interpretation. Because you see, when let's say if you go on the internet, like pick Quora, like this would, or just type on Google and question these issues, you realize that the first things that, say, imagine you're a 12-year-old that for the first time hears of these things, goes on the internet and starts reading about this, and basically that's the source of information that he or she gets from it. Well, what could balance those views? Nothing, because schools basically fueled them, families fueled them from both sides. I'm not talking again. That I'm obviously conservative, but this has nothing to do with the fact that this is not a problem for both sides of the story, because again, it's a deep historical misunderstanding to pretend that there is something wrong just in half of your countries, if this could be separated from your culture entirely. Yes, your culture has a problem, and it's not just the problem of the other side, because your side is doing something worse, and if it is actually the right side, as I believe the conservative one is, the problem, again, is not what others do, but what you do. Right, and even of course, if you may be actually the good one that keeps, say, standards that are at least better than the average, and so it's overall contributing for an to an improvement, still, there is. That's why today I talk of ideological recrudescence, because there is no easy choice, right? It's not that, for example, that family is kind of a better institutional um, system in theory that the actual families, even when they are actually better, say, than educational institutions, are actually a positive thing. Like, having a dysfunctional family or even just a family that doesn't teach you anything or just teaches you how to be a moron, may provide you with some stability from one side, but from the other, it will make you unavoidably fail. Because, again, that emotional stability is not everything, right? You also would be supposed to be an intelligent person, and without intelligence, you have already failed. You can be 20, 30, 40, 50. You will always stay like that if you don't make any effort. So I'm a great fan, of course, of traditional family and everything, and I will never let any other institution take it over. But the question is also, for example, how much confidence are families spreading towards the very concept of education, for example? Because we have arrived to the point which says, no, I'm the average moron, and so my teaching will be enough, and I will never make, say, my children study something like history, for example, because those are just old Marxist stuff. And what does history have to do with that, right? If you're an ignorant and you cannot afford an education, not because you're too poor, but because you're too stupid, and the two things are probably very closely connected. The question is, why do you have to drag others into the abyss, into the darkness? This is what is occurring right now. The reason why this wasn't occurring up to a certain time ago is that there was margin for improvement. Like the idea of achievement and of effort were stronger, right? Both because objectively times were easier, but also because properly the word came from a stronger moral backbone, which doesn't mean, say, being more morally strong doesn't mean to be necessarily or just per se, let's say, better, more intelligent, right? Being more morally strong will actually provide you with the capacity of taking steps that are more difficult, and therefore probably that pressure will probably teach you something. But the idea is that if you don't have a wide theoretical support to that, you cannot achieve much. It's like what von Clausewitz simply says, that it's obvious that the soldier in the front line can even get himself killed, but doesn't have the intelligence that is required, and even the moral sacrifice of a general that maybe doesn't die, but will have on his shoulders the entirety of the country responsibility, and for your death included, which is something that requires a much greater moral capacity. And that this very concept you see as a properly designed, very often coming even there from socialistic propaganda, saying the butchers, the elite is bad, is whatever, is actually a populistic myth. It's a collectivistic myth. It doesn't reflect reality. People who are in charge on average are better than the rest of the people in terms of capacity. There is no doubt. It's like, that's another disgusting thing that has been spreading recently, to rehabilitate in a completely relativistic sense, let's say, some countries that fought wars now, is the idea that every person who falls fighting for a war is owed some sort of respect. Well, humanly speaking, I can understand the concept of these people dying in the most horrifying ways, and having, after all, still decided, as it always happens, even if they had been kind of threatened, it was still their choice to get there, right? And first of all, doing that for an ideology or another still does make a difference. But every time you step in front of one of these graves, the question is, what the hell do I know this was a child rapist or not? Why should I owe this person any respect just per se? And very often this thing is weaponized by people say, they weren't all bad, right? And then you go look at what their actual, this people's blogs or something it is, and it's just a cheap, relativistic, completely strategically uneducated version of what according to them, I don't know, World War II was, and pretending that just because they go, taking selfies in military cemeteries, they're somewhat, morally evolved people. Right, this is the scum of the earth, and they don't bring anything to the world, right? Also, because frankly, I don't think that you need to be lectured by them when you step in an actual military century. What can spark in you for all the broader reflections and implications that, if you really don't have, maybe an indicator that you can just follow that kind of cheap idea, and that is a problem. That is a real problem. But aside from that, which doesn't mean that I go disrespecting, military graves, and regardless of where they are. Let's say I feel, very differently depending on many issues regarding, whose graves these are, and that's what history should immediately, like, if you know any history, that should immediately tell you something, right? Just imagine one of those soldiers that raped and killed in Bucha or in other Ukrainian towns, died, and now somewhere they will be buried in a military cemetery. Should we respect them? Of course not, because simply we can afford not to, and we don't have to respond anyone for that. And that's what it's called liberty, and because it's not just freedom based on the concept of, okay, I do whatever I want. I am free in the measure in which I understand and I know, and I can afford to judge on the base of actual evidence and of a hierarchical system that is providing me with that culture at the end of the day. So my point is the following: considering what is occurring in the world today, basically at every level that I see of social media, is a sort of desperate need of fitting a group, right? There is in whichever it is. You see, I'm not a libertarian either, because I believe that libertarians fundamentally are making an excuse for unloading personal responsibility and the actual efforts that are needed cooperatively to build up a civilization. Not that a libertarian is anti-communitarian at all, but the way at least this is declined today seems rather like I shouldn't be imposed anything, because if I don't understand the meaning of that imposition, then I feel just that I have the faculty of resisting it. You have, because every human being has, but there is a level of authority, discipline, and an order that must be understood civilizationally speaking. That is not about imposing something for the sake of parasitically depending on you, but it's imposing something in order to save our lives altogether, which is exactly what happens in times of war with, say, martial law. Why are some civic rights suspended in that instance? And we all agree on that. Well, because we know civilizationally that is functional to the struggle that we are carrying out. So that's a big difference from the kind of imposition that you're normally seeing. And this distrust, in fact, towards universal powers, towards those who actually provide for a real model, occurs in many different ways. Again, most of the times it's envy, right? Calling everything imperialistic, for example, just to justify any, or pointing at colonialism just for saying, okay, that is, whoever had colonies basically was bad and should be ashamed. Why? What? Who? By the way, first of all, because things changed, and not only in a random way, but it changed in the sense that exactly those who had colonies became the most advanced and civically developed countries in the world, where people live the best lives, including people coming from those countries that were colonized, and most of the others really are not the same way. But it's more than that. It's again, that recognition that if you don't like somebody's better than you, you want to take him down. Right? Doesn't matter how positive that person can be, just for the fact that you envy that. And this is true for socialism in general. Basically, theoretical communism is just an autoimmune disease. Practical communism is just stealing from other people. There is no other logic to it. There is no human dignity. There is no humanity in the first place. It's probably not contemplated specifically in it. In fact, what we see today is not much Marxism, it's what I call cultural Marxism. And people say, oh, cultural Marxism does not exist. You don't understand what Marxism is. I exactly agree. That's why I call it cultural Marxism, because you don't even know what Marxism is. That's why you kind of call yourself like that, because if you just, first of all, have a smartphone or a car, or you have whatever, first of all, you can't be a communist by definition. And secondly, you just don't know the whole deal. You just don't know German or Russian to study Marx and Lenin. Hence, you're not a communist by definition. You don't know anything about that. You cannot weigh essentially what even communism represents in relative terms to the rest of history. You just give it for granted. You sell yourself in a way that basically, has no difference but being, fan of a football team, to pretend some pseudo-intellectual capacity, and you basically just by leaving confirm that you are betraying completely all that, fortunately, that lunacy. And that's why I call you cultural Marxist, because you're exactly just, chit-chatting bullshit about communism that you don't even understand. And this is not just on the base of the fact that communism slaughtered hundreds of millions of innocent people for no reason, and mostly actual political administrative incapacity, which I don't think is necessarily something better than, having a scientific planning of genocide, for example, because, those are still dead people killed in the most horrifying ways. But at the same time, it's properly having failed to even begin to accept that there is a history to study, that there is not an ideology to pick with some sort of pseudo-socioeconomical scientificity and pretending that that is, your valid path of interpretation for your own life. And the easy aspect of that is that whenever you talk to these people, you understand that they haven't even opened a history manual. But not even about contemporary history, right? I'm not even talking about modern, medieval, or ancient. Here we're talking about properly the whole deal, having a history that makes sense. That's why, as a European citizen, by the way, and that's one of the very positive things of the European Union that I strongly support in the idea of it, not because I'm a leftist or because I like, certain things that happen or going on, but just because it's a huge opportunity and we have done already enormous much to improve our condition, and in ways that were not even considered to be possible, and through the best of our intelligentsia, that fascism and Nazism and communism are on the same level, and are considered such by the European Union, right? And albeit they're not on the same level, here it means that they are in the box of the ideologies that are essentially the reason for which every human being waking up in the morning, even if they had nothing to do with neither fascism, Nazism, or communism, should watch him or herself in the mirror and feeling ashamed to be a human being, right? So I don't understand really whoever is still tolerating communism as a legal association in the world. Why we should be tolerating the idea that since, in Western Europe at least, we had Nazi fascism as more, just present, and, we are being directly responsible for. This should be just an excuse for somebody to, just chant communist songs and wear sickle and hammer symbols, because those should be prohibited and quite seriously investigated, just as we do for, right-wing extremism. And we do, because, of course, there are plenty of communist terrorists that have bloodshed Europe and the rest of the world. Fortunately, in Europe, much less than what the million of people that have been massacred all over the world, for those people that still inhabit there today, not to give a fuck, because that's basically what communism eventually translates itself into. That is depriving, of course, not just the individual of any human dignity, but, of course, of eliminating any form of knowledge, because that's the first goal, and that's the first meaning of humanity in the first place. It's properly emptying the better human being that you can be on purpose to exploit it, right? Not only that, but again, from the right side of the story, or I should say, better say, because it's not a right side at this point, considering the average anymore, that conservatism is basically the only island where you would find anyone having, a cultural dignity at this point. And this is true for any other place of the world, because it's the only place where you can still find basically a trace, a memory, right, of what the core behavioral pattern really was. This is not just about a matter of, say, you see, many liberals that I know are, of course, intelligent people, and I have no doubt that I would prefer, as I did in the past, just comparatively them to many conservatives that I know on a regular basis. And frankly, like when I go in the street and I meet people in just feeling mode, I loathe basically both, just by that degree of individual unintelligence that you can find basically as the average, right? But the problem is that there have been, and maybe I will make another video about this, that is to say, all the myths that liberals made you believe, and made also conservatives believe, about history, and properly the pattern narrative that was used to make you convinced that the times we arrived in are simply and, let's say, factorially as an indicator, the best, right? This is not to say that we're not living objectively in the best times ever. I do believe so, right? I do think that what we achieved is an achievement of morality and science that at some point are practically indistinguishable. The point I'm making today is that the system, as many others in the past, after growing so much, will probably have some dramatic, will suffer some dramatic collapse. Not maybe in the, apocalyptic, hopefully not, but it can still happen quite quickly and quite easily. But let's say in a not in a colossal way, let's say in a short term, but let's say in a fashion that will basically render incapable people to react in the future. Like how, let's say, I think that the possibilities of the world taking out itself disruptively in a very quick way, like some nuclear accident or some natural disaster. I'm talking about even what was thought up to a few decades ago not to be much of a possibility, but even having a meteor hitting the Earth seems to be extremely more likely than we thought. Or massive earthquakes, volcanic explosions. It can still happen. Think about the big one in California and all these things. But in general, we know these things happen, and it's strange they normally, they haven't happened yet at some level statistically. So that's as easy as it could be, and it could easily, and if not erase humanity, but at least bring it back to some level that we can really start speaking of an end of the world of some sort. But I think if everything went well, and realistically, the way the world would end is quite easy. It would be about people losing any motivation. It would be people becoming static, both mentally and physically, and simply depending on something else like machines or whatever, and dying. Like not having properly the purpose of making anything function, even though this would require naturally that passivity. Still, let's say a human body could immediately wake up again for the most elementary needs, but it's the collective, it's the civilizational dimension that cannot. And that's the proof that I think we're witnessing today, that again, up to a few generations ago, or even my own, even just basic moral hierarchy was understood in its political social manifestation. I mean, the same idea of merit, the same idea of even of honesty, or simply, of discipline, of order, of competence, of simply wanting the best person making, the best job they can do in order to get the best results for them and everybody. And all the implications, they're not at all vicious about, this thing, in fact, benefiting the entirety of the community, that today are not just, let's say, contested per se, because there has always been the pain in the ass that said, from the radical, leftistic, extremistic minority that was also needed to keep the orthodoxy alive. This happened in every single culture, everywhere in history, at any time. It was always the same old story. Communism was not invented by Marx. Communism always existed as a concept of nothingness, of darkness, of evil, that was designed, in a sense, also deriving from human tragedy, right? I'm not saying that communism is just, you take off the mask of a communist, there is a snake under it or something like that, but barely, let's say. But let's say there is a human tragedy. I mean, that is evil, and the lack properly of constructive approach and of wanting to solve things lucidly, clearly, rationally, with moral force and pride and ambition and willingness to exploit it, it's taken away. It's basically the failure of the weak in front of the effort that civilization requires in order to be kept up. It's not a form of justice. It's not, because there's no such things like a form of justice. Justice is justice, point. There are no diversions. There's no such thing like social justice, whatever, because if you immediately add that adjective, you spoil that. It's like the truth, right? It's all one. It's like reason. Those things are not declined by adjectivation. The point is that it's not, again, just the criticism, it's the blissfulness. I mean, the fact that we are raising kids now, completely ignoring that world in which we were habituated to live in normally existed. That's how fast the world changed. And we don't have here, first of all, just by default, the slightest civilizational idea on how to cope with this successfully, at least in a practical sense, because, I mean, you could, again, indoctrinate people in the right direction, but the question is, again, how do you do it? Right? You could say, well, if everybody knew what we know, all right, but how? Right? Given that now, in reality, this is not the case. Where do you find even just the force and the strength? Surely won't be my videos that will fix any of this on a sensible scale, but the let's say it's properly the lack of that knowledge, of that awareness. The trick that we have been fooled into thinking, especially by the liberals, is that there are this kind of that civilizational values do not require an effort to attain because they are allegedly intrinsic within any person. This is actually not true. I mean, the idea of being, of course, of let's say justice, reason, truth can be found, right? Also, the Declaration of Independence of the United States surely shows this. The fact that these principles are self-evident, they're evident by themselves, is exactly this aspect. Not that they are out there just magically per se, but that whenever a person witnesses them, we humanly recognize that they are. But these principles must be attained, right? If you don't pass them down generations, people will forget them, will properly forget, especially the cost they had, right? And that's the meaning they had, because without cost there can't be meaning. If you don't suffer, you don't learn anything. So we're posed in front of an enormous challenge, because for the first time in history we need more theoretical than practical capacity, because again, unless of course civilization would go down to the point of disruption, we would have to learn quickly again. So that would be a very interesting scenario, see how the older, what we considered as common culture up to 20 years ago would be properly reinvestigated, and how much mental fuss, probably not, maybe because they would be boosted by practicing in there, but let's say how much complicated debates would come from determining how this situation formed. It was that easy why our tradition formed, if one just again makes the effort of learning something about that. It may take a long time, may take decades, but it can be done. It doesn't even require this intensive learning or studying. And it's not even just intuitive per se, right? It is by a certain degree, but again, you need evidence, and this evidence can be provided by history itself, of course, and what we see also in these on my channel very often in the interpretation of it. When this is confused by pretending that every human being becomes the arbiter of all the rest of the world without, however, having acquired any critical capacity, you make the whole thing collapse. We should teach people that having an opinion has nothing to do with this opinion having any value. Right? Because the only value it could have is that you are a burden for the rest of the others by not having it. Right? That's the only relevance that your opinion would have. Right? Everybody should be entitled to express their own opinion, but this has nothing to do with the value of an opinion. None of that. Right? Including violent reaction, meaning that if your opinion is, denying the Holocaust, you're just an imbecile. If your opinion is, I want to kill you, because you don't obey to my religion, whatever ideas are, I'm gonna kill you because I don't know, you want to escape from our relationship. I don't know. In my world, if probably I have a huge trust in public authority, and I want to, to very strongly operate and to defend me. But if there wasn't such a thing in my world, that would be you being on an obituary table with a broken neck 30 minutes later, right? So that is exactly what tradition means. And that's why also I don't like libertarianism, and I was libertarian and even federalist, federalist at least in an anti kind of broader power sense, but still federalist as far as the idea of a federation of ever larger proportions could be. Because what I noticed is that even there, the effort was not made, let's say, for a libertarian to boost properly the development of the individual, so not to make it reliant or influenced on others because they are strong enough to take their own action to interact with others. But just being libertarian saying, no, I don't want to pay taxes. I mean, we are at this level of idiocy. But that is not to say, okay, over the fact that you didn't want to pay taxes, the American War of Independence was made, but that point was not the taxes, right? It was just like the Civil War was not really slavery. It was just fought over that. The actual practice, also because the British didn't have means to enforce tax collection on America, simply, even just on the rest of the population, right? It was something else. It was about a right to self-determination. It was about the capacity of, the evidently fulfilled capacity of creating something more and something even greater than the same Britain, which is a big deal considering the times and the places. So history does take this direction, and it does take it also for human mistakes, for human misunderstanding. There's always a better option all the time for whichever thing you do. You can do, like, even the best things that happen in history, like, could have been done better, right? And could have been properly born in a much more effective and responsible fashion at all levels. But this doesn't mean, in fact, that we shouldn't recognize the intrinsic value of the same on a hierarchical level. That's why you can't fundamentally be against such ideologies if you're not a moral relativist, right? That's the single most important problem that we have nowadays. Again, is pretending that reality is subjective, as if this had anything to do with our relation with the truth. Of course, reality is subjective, but it's also objective. Why do you need to stress the fact that it's just subjective, so that everybody can do whatever the fuck that they want, and so you hope that a system will crumble because you hate it, and because you hate yourself and you just can't fix it by yourself? That's how the thing really works, and how they trick you, how they take away from you any dignity of culture, of wisdom, of beauty. Beauty should be an important civilizational value. We shouldn't be tolerating the enforcement of deterior symbols that essentially just inspire us to be worse. Look at ads on YouTube. I know I can't control what kind of ads. I thought before inserting them last year that you could control the type of ads, and there is some degree of customization, but it's just in YouTube's hands. Look at what all these, let's say, common items, like it be glasses, it can be clothing, things like that, drinks, right? This cheap stuff are sponsored like. It's basically a melange of people that do not have any form of clear cultural background. Right there, men dressed as women, women dressed as men, all possible races mixed for no reason. Not that I'm against, I'm for, say, I don't believe that monocultural realities exist, but let's say I don't see any positive reason for which. Yeah, I understand that the brand can be global, this ads can go global, but the question is, first of all, it's a very narrow view of race. Like you rarely see an Asian guy there. You see just this is most American designed sponsors, like very white people next to very black people, because that's basically what it means for the culturally hegemonic U.S. to be multiculturally acceptable, right? The rest does not exist, and that aspect of self-referentiality is the tumor, is exactly what spreads the incapacity of contemplating something outside of that, of comparing. What they want to do with you there is not pushing you to be like these people. Actually, they want you to push to be the opposite of that, because those ads are designed actually to piss you off, to provoke you, not to show you an orderly idea of what you would like to have. And even say race in here, as you know, I've never understood, frankly, racism in an ideological sense. I can understand that you like or dislike somebody on the basis of appearance, and if some race groups have some statistically some phenotypical look that you don't like, hey, it happens. But it's normal to be attracted to other humans in general. Race is not a red line in an absolute sense, or it never is, humanly speaking. In the question is what they want to show you there is the lack of any form of preconceived notion. That is to say, any form of order, something put together to make something sensible. Or none of those people in those ads make effort. None of those people are promising students or professional experts or people with support, with power. Usually, car ads are more like that, because they're aimed at people that have slightly more money than the average, and so they want to show, look, you could become, you made that effort to win that money, so you're better than the others, so you can buy this car. If you're just a regular idiot that, I want to sell you a pair of glasses, I can show you that, every idiot can buy this stuff, and being part of this group where nobody gives a fuck about each other, basically, but it's still better than making any effort to be, to be better, or to think that maybe those glasses are practically irrelevant, and that there's no aesthetics to it, that there's no taste, that there's no broader inspiration to maybe some other artistic values, etc. No. Every unqualified mediocre person with terrible look and clothes can appear normal, right? And that's what they want. They want to flatten you to the point where you will feel that living in your fourth estate world is something normal that you shouldn't care about as long as you pay them. So this is a point, but the broader being that if we forget what we have produced, just in terms of knowledge, yes, but also how this can positively applied in the world, somebody will be needed to reteach this. And the problem is that if you got dishabituated to it, that is to say, if the entire, say, educational system in general has bought the narrative that fundamentally it's not about effort or commitment or merit or capacity or experience or competence, but it's just about you sitting there practically just being you and doing nothing about it, how will we convince, even in the face of disaster, and this is evident also today, that those means that are, again, authority, discipline, order, rationality, clarity, lucidity, moral resistance, I mean, simply being able to tolerate an effort are useful. That's the scary thing. It's that easy to get dehabituated to effort, and you can even just measure it from a physical point of view. The mental one is much worse because the mental one, let's say, drifts much more easily, right? At least your body, more or less, it's less flexible, but at least follows a pattern that more or less you have an idea where it can reach without too terrifying pathologies over the decades. With your mind, it's really not the case, because again, if you never step further and you presume that, after all, you're fine just the way you are, you will probably neither wake up one day and realize that you were wrong. So you will just remain, you will just fly low, you will be a problem for yourself, for the others, because you're less capable, you're less resourceful, you can literally do less for the world. And first of all, for yourself, because you see, this is not like a task that somebody assigns to you. Civilization tells us that the full meaning of humanity is just acting on your behalf, on your own behalf. It's not about the others. It's just knowing that following some patterns that others have already followed, you can be more aware of the situation, wasting less time, doing everything much more quickly, but simply just having your own ideas and pushing them further. That's the promise, right? When people say effort, they think, again, the superstition of the master that exploits them. They don't see, I may be nurtured under the guidance of a higher mind and blossoming in it. This concept is being completely erased. Maybe it will be reaffirmed thanks to the new feudalism that will likely take place at this point. But, and I think, interestingly enough, that this ideological shape is already taking form in a way. It's doing it, first of all, through the collapse of the previous effort. Remember the thing I said about the middle classes and how they should be the ones that actually work well. First, there is the collapse of those ones, and then there are the elites essentially modeling the idea that the elite is good and the others are bad. And this actually does stem from a real assessment, but doesn't mean that there's been necessarily even a positive or negative improvement at some level. Maybe under that feudal hierarchy we would achieve more than now. So all in all, it wouldn't be that bad. It would be worse for more people, but at least these people would be incapable, and so they would have deserved that. So it's a condition that they triggered by themselves. It's not somebody exploiting them. It's essentially themselves letting be exploited. and again, this already happens. How many people just need to have an income and say, you see, today there is no such thing like slavery, but people are enslaving themselves in a mental sense. That is to say, they're free. There's even something keeping that freedom up with great effort, but for them, the only thing is, what do I want? I want to have fun, right? So I don't want to do anything. I just need a steady income that allows me just, in theory, not to do anything else in the meanwhile. That's the concept. You don't want an income because you want to improve yourself as a human being, or becoming more powerful, or achieving something greater for which you will really impact the world. No, I want an income so that women will not think I'm a loser because I can't afford a car, or I just live in a stinky flat with one room, and so everything will seemingly look shinier. If you reason like that, you have serious problem, right? You are already within the cage that you built around yourself, and the reason why you're not successful is exactly because you reason like that. And this is not even to say that it's hard to change that. It's not hard to change that. This is about the fact that there are no other options. That's another thing that they have habituated you to think that this is just a way of living and that it's good like another because, hey, everybody decides what is better, right? No. If you believe in science, if you believe in the truth, if you believe in reason, you perfectly know that there is no such a thing like one thing equal to another. That our concept of equality should stem from equality of opportunities in a world that still, by the way, works to afford them for the rest, because civilizationally we could we understand how powerful it is to provide the individual for that capacity, so that we can all benefit from that. The point is that we just did it and it didn't work because the individual was not enough to essentially be maintained by the system, as opposed to just what their parents or grandparents did, that is to say, actually earning their income, right, and providing for those resources that their children have completely spoiled because, in a sense, yes, they were good at working, but they didn't have any theoretical capacity to teach them that effort must be kept up over time. Right, let's be honest, the 20th century was like this. Like, at least in the West, we were the lucky ones. We after World War II, we really skyrocketed, thankfully, to the terribly imperialistic Americans that did so great damage. They surely had their own problems, and we all had also, given that we were liberated by them from things like Nazi fascism. So what the fuck are we to complain about in the first place? Just the Americans were in their own way, and we were in others, but they were better. And the point is that we said, okay, finally, really, like after basically an entire history of misery, of poverty, whatever, you can really have your own house, being free, having a car, living in a safe world, or at least one that was maintained. So, at least with not particular warfare, because that was frozen by nuclear weapons. And having it, damn, right? It's obvious. Let's say it's human to presume that you would have thought that things would have always improved, like Fukuyama's thought. It was a big illusion, right? And not because there was something wrong in the ways we managed to achieve that wealth, because that was the right thing. Hell, we achieved them in the best way everyone ever did historically. The question is, again, how to keep that up, that nobody had ever coped with, simply because that condition historically had never verified, or at least it had verified, but not in the same absolute level. There's always been like the peak of a civilization and then some kind of fall, but even the falls are not to be given for granted, at least in that markedly sinusoidal fashion. So because you can maybe even succeed to keep things up, and part of the reason is, again, because we came from that civilization that was somewhat aware at the end of the day. And I'm just thinking of the average moron that, doesn't think about these things because nobody told him. And sadly enough, it seems that, again, we gave dramatically too much trust, right? We paid enormously for this, at the end of the day, reckless, because it's also our fault anyway, idea that just by providing people with liberty, they would be able to autonomously understand the value of it. Right? So the problem is not giving them liberty. The problem was not checking how they would be able to maintain that. Sometimes it succeeded. I mean, especially in the West, because surprise, surprise, we were kind of more habituated to it in the first place, and we were the ones who invented that in the first place. So, also too much distinction, frankly, between Europe and the United States, let's say, the Western world in general, Canada, Australia, broadly speaking. Also, it's not a big deal. We really were one, and it was a really big, and we still are, by the way. And so, there is a really big divide, right? And sometimes you would be amazed by how simple it is to make things better. That's yet another thing that you're not being told, right? If instead you're always thinking that you have been stolen opportunities. This is such a rigged system that we don't know how to come out of this. It's terrifying. Oh my God, you will immediately make it worse further, right? So concerns are legitimate, and of course the indicators today do not really display any positive datum about the trend, at least. But there is, I think, very little doubt of the fact that this is just a mood, an atmosphere that we made up, and that, as many things that are happening today, say most of the things we concern ourselves about, or that we somewhat concern ourselves with, are not really the most important ones that are happening. And that we didn't even contemplate that would be happening. So being aware of your own potential, for example, and not feeling that speeches like mine are just a reproach, as if you couldn't practically have any other chance in your life because you're doomed, is not really probably not really the best attitude. You should realize that this is provoking you. This is what we do as conservatives. Like, you want to know the actual difference between conservatives and liberals without all, political, logical inquiry. It's simply the difference between harshness and leniency. Conservatives realize that in order to toughen yourself up and to be effective, to be free, to be capable, to be successful, you have to go through hardship. Liberals just want everything to go without effort, and to tolerate, and to say, okay, well, yeah, you did that bad, but let's forget about this for now, and let's go on and to pretend that this didn't happen, right? Instead, where do you draw the line? We all do, in a way or the other. It's normal. That's the two opposite archetypes. But the question is, where do you draw the line? Because the only reason why we're not going towards hardship is that it's hard, right? Because it requires effort. But we know it's the better direction, for sure. But it's tiring at some point. Yeah, but, how much do you evaluate the truth, reason, justice, your own life at the end of the day? You can always do more. This is not to say that liberals do not make effort, but the mental pattern is we make effort so that people do not have to make effort. No, that's fucked up. Like, that's the opposite direction you should be following if you want anything to go well, and for you actually to make much less effort. Because this is the trick also of the vituperated democracy. You can't fix, let's say, every community has a degree of welfare, right? Historically, there is even trying to draw a difference between what's socialistic or non-socialistic is stupid. Again, it's another communistic invention that has nothing to do with reality. Humanity is made like this. Humanity is about giving and taking in different measure, right? If you're more driven, more aggressive, more offensive, you know how to achieve things, and so you mostly take. right? To manage to seize at least, but also you're giving in a way. If you're lenient, it's the same way. You can give a lot to people, but you also are buying them in a sense to make them, to flatter them that their problems really do not exist, and you increase the problem. So the question in many ways is, again, how much do you hypostasize the cause of whatever happens out of yourself? That is to say, in other words, how much do you unload your moral responsibility on something or someone else? And how much are you personally doing to fix the issue for real, from a real base? Because the first thing is somewhat, you see, this mixes emotions and reason at the same time. Reason is a tool that guides us. So if I know that there is something that doesn't work, and I need to fix it, but it requires sometimes to be harsh with someone, I will evaluate what's the cost benefit of this for, if I am a moral person, I presume everyone involved, and that's what a true conservative should reason like, and then I will take action accordingly. And it's going to be hard most of the times. Again, it's like, I don't know if you've ever been in a relationship with someone that was not that bright, let's put it in this way, and you maybe loved her, but let's say you were trying to make her understand maybe something, and she would take it as a sort of criticism. How often does that happen? It happens very often. And that's exactly the point. I think it lays also in the dichotomy masculine-feminine in many ways. It's obviously that conservatism is kind of more masculine, and liberalism is more feminine. Just because, again, it's harshness and leniency. They should be balanced. They couldn't exist one without the other. And that's also the thing that you're trying to be, that they're trying to erase from your mind. That is to say that masculinity and femininity exist only in function to each other. And that you are a full human the more properly you are pursuing the archetype of your own sex, and more functional you are, because that's the way to bond, to glue the most, right? Maybe you liked her because she was very attractive, but maybe she was not that bright, so you wanted to help her because you say, maybe I feel something, I feel lenient to the point of saying, okay, well, she's kind of, it's not because I'm a pig that just wants to, to exploit certain wifely functions, let's put it in this way, but it's because, after all, I'm lenient to the point of saying, this is a fellow human being, I like her and want to stay with her, let's try to help her, maybe being better. Well, this would be considered sexist today, or some kind of patronizing and whatever. This is not. You should be challenging people, and when you realize that there is a level in culture where you start finding people that are all broken that way, and that basically are all paranoid, that because simply nobody told them that they could do better, or that there is that also doing this better is not flattering them. How better can you do? You're so good, and that they don't do anything. You have to solicit them. You have to provoke them. You have to offend them, to spark them and say, some are too weak. This is the result. Some are too weak and just can't take it. I mean, just recently, what it was, and there was a girl I talked to, and okay, we were chatting, so it was not really personal thing. She said, "Oh my God, but you talk like too complexly. You're not talking to your student." I mean, I was writing in English, by the way, and more or less I say the same things I say here. So does it seem to you that I speak in a too complex way? Like, I couldn't tell her, but maybe, you should be worried, because if this is complex talking to you, maybe you may want to check some mental deficiency from your side, but that's unavoidable to think from my side, because I don't think that I'm particularly intelligent. I just think that the other person is dumb, and it's terrifying, because at the point of being told, like, that it's a demerit for you to speak in a somewhat articulate way, you start understanding why civilization is collapsing, why people don't want to make any effort, and they, at this point, are so habituated to mediocrity that do not even think rationally, that saying to somebody, look, you speak more too complexly, is not an offense, but it should be like a compliment, actually, and that you may want to benefit from talking with somebody that speaks more complexly than you. I must say, I also fear sometimes when a girl is fiercely intelligent. Not just I say this because I just talk to girls and my social interaction stops to that, frankly. And so I have no idea how it would be talking to men in that regard. In actual conversations. I mean, I can see your comments here, but that's another story. Um, which basically never happens because I don't find this kind of people that are fiercely intelligent. But whenever they are intelligent, I may worry that this person really is taking, too many directions for me to maybe be confident that she may, just think I am in the direction she's gonna choose in the end. But at the same time, I say, wow, finally someone that, I can rely on for having a dialogue, an actual communication that, I ask something about and that she asks something about me. And that's beautiful. I don't see this as normality, and I don't consider this as normal. I actually consider it as something extremely rare. And I'm convinced that I'm not a particularly intelligent person. That I'm not evidently. I've never been a genius. Never been a dramatically above average intelligence ever. I think I'm pretty average. Again, I may have learned lots of things, but that's it. Maybe, of course, that's how intelligence is made, but it's not kind of humanly incompatible form of intelligence. It's how, again, the better person should manifest by just trying to make sense of reality in order to solve problems and making the thing better for everyone. Naturally, this varies from person to person because you just do know that there are people you can't cope with already by themselves, but the problem is always emotionally related to this lack of order, this lack of center, this lack. I've met lots of, for example, kind of psychotic people that said, I don't know, I feel anxious all the time, or I can't solve problems, or maybe even very intelligent people that did lots of things at a time, were smart, etc., but that didn't have a center. Then you scratch under the surface, and aside from the overwhelming amount of single motherhood, lack of proper parenting at least, and whatever, and traumas, whatever, the first thing that defines these people is the fact that they have decided quite early on in their life that there is no such thing like an objective reality. That is to say, they just built their entire world as a sort of mist where they float into without order. And you see, this was even actually the not really the existentialist problem per se. Damn, I hate existentialism, frankly, at least especially the communist form of it that prevailed, because otherwise any philosophical current has its pros and cons. But those ideas came about, say, even especially in the second half of the 20th century. Yes, I know existentialism is before, but I mean, in a broader cultural sense, I mean, this cliche, this idea that there's no meaning in the universe, we are alone. The thing, why did it come about? And especially, where's the evidence for that? I mean, it's not about saying find the evidence of the contrary. This is just saying, why would you, like, don't you have any other purpose? Don't you see what you have in front of you to make your life better? For arriving at the point of depressing yourself with, yet there is no purpose. If you think that there is no purpose, it means that you basically don't get yourself in anything, that you're bored, that you lack mental application, that you, I don't know, you didn't even try, or you decided to be extremely lenient with yourself and just lazy off there and pretending that since you don't have anything, you didn't make yourself having anything to do, has anything to do with the alleged lack of meaning in absolute sense. I don't understand. I mean, it's so evidently connected to the fact that you just decided not to do anything, not to interest in anything, or even if you do, still in doing it in a very unsystematic and therefore incomplete and fallacious and inconsistent way. That's the only thing I see. before those times, it was always, let's say, the word was coming from an idea of duty. This was especially impressed in the 19th century. There was a sense of duty because there were some values that were greater. This was accepted. And the thing, you see, humanity went down at that point because we were getting better, exactly in a sense, through the idea of duty, and we softened up to the point that we, as I was saying before, we forgot the idea that we had to strive for it, because maybe it was so generally accepted, or maybe it's also because certain leftistic culture prevailed, at least in entertainment, things like that, that it was normal even to accept that the top, the elite, the best, was some sort of obscure, overlord that wanted to exploit you and to squeeze you. But there is no evidence of this in actual history. I mean, in I don't know how to say this. Communists will make their history, but it's not history that is accepted in academies. At least in my own, I've never seen anything like that. I know that in many private ones they do this thing, but let's say it's not scientifically accurate. It's based on a lot of assumptions that basically never end, that infiltrate the whole system, and there is evidently just political pamphleting behind that propagandistic agenda, nothing else. You can immediately spot it. Just again, the simple-minded. Why communism does spread among poor people? Because they're poor? Not because they're on average less educated, because they know less. It's that easy. It's not about poverty. There's a lot of poor people that are educated and intelligent and see communism as an insanity. But again, this was just as average understanding within the range of common knowledge up to a few decades ago. It may be, again, that, of course, we are the products of a world that doesn't recognize certain things anymore, because there were still people at the time who were allowed to think like that. But this, again, has nothing to do with the validity of that opinion. If you believe in science, which is, again, something that many conservatives at this point have taken science as leftism. So I will prefer the Bible over science, as if there was a difference, by the way, in the purpose of both. It's just even there, it's the collapse of traditional culture. It basically means that you don't understand anything. Like if you, even about the things that you're pretending to be knowing, right? It's like even the liberal version of Christianity. It's just about love each other, man, tolerate everything, let everything. Why? How do you love anyone if you reason like this? You're ashamed. There is no such Christianity based on such premises. You have to study the Bible, not picking memes from the internet and pretending to make a biblical exegesis on base of your underschooling. It doesn't work like that. It's like the meaning of the same religion itself. I mean, how many conservatives says, oh yes, I've seen angels. Yes, you have seen angels. Then you ask these people what angels are. They don't even know what they meant in the history of religion. What's the archetypal anthropological meaning of angels? What's their purpose? Where they came from? What they have to do with your soul? What's the purpose properly of such soul living within you? Because that's the meaning of the personal God. It's a soft version of based on contemporary art and again popular culture view of what angels are, so that you understand that all these people that think in those terms are just mass hallucinated, because the concept of angel has nothing to do with that. In tradition, it's a completely different thing. So you understand how easily these people are hallucinated. You're not special because you think you have seen angels. You're just an idiot who had no other way to call for attention because of his own insignificance as an individual, but to invent something that on a symbol that they don't even understand at the core of the very tradition they're supposed to be embodying or defending or whatever. So I already made a video like this last winter. Remember this. Conservative is better, but being a conservative doesn't spare you from cultural underdevelopment, right? Being a conservative is just being a liberal. That 90% of the cases, you're just an idiot. So on average, there is nothing to be proud of it either, right? You're just to prove to be an intelligent person, to surpass the dichotomy that left and right, especially in today's political compass, are somewhat representative of the whole spectrum of reality, because they're, in the way they're conceived, they're actually also collectivistically understood. They just work on an horizontal reality and not on a vertical one, right? We stopped looking above, and we stopped, in this sense, properly understanding what matters, what not. It's as if somebody forced you to watch only the ground and never looking up. This is the current situation of our culture, maybe worldwide. And again, up to a very few generations ago, somewhere, especially here, you had people habitually looking only up. Maybe it was even too extremistic. You have to look at both some ways, but up is better, for sure. Other places probably, on average, never watched up, right? Or even if they did, traditionally at some point, they forgot it pretty quickly, and there is none of that today, because they were much more easily prey of other ideologies that forced them to look down, or even to bury their head under the sand, right? And this is essentially what they're forcing you to do today in the West. At least many from the same West. I'm not saying the other countries or whatever. It comes a bit from everywhere, right? All right, so I know that some of you at least liked my rambles, and so every once in a while I come up with these ideas on the risks of ideologization. Sometimes I never get or never nailed the point in some way, but I presume that I manage, if anything, because I wouldn't stop to speak ever, that this stuff has some meaning / purpose regarding to the subject matter, and some of you appreciate. And the real reason being, today I wanted to make a video about medieval German warfare that I'll probably do tomorrow. But I forgot 50 years in timeline to find the pictures for, and so I will do it today, and then we will talk about something else soon. Also more interesting for the American audience, I must say, for July the 4th. But for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.